We now turn our attention to the reproductive system. We're going to focus on the sex organs in this lecture, largely focused on how gametes are produced. And then in subsequent lectures, we'll talk about the control of that gamete production. So this mini lecture is largely focused on the question of how the gametes are produced by males and females, with particular emphasis on sort of the steps of producing gametes and where that occurs in the anatomy. So gametes undergo cell divisions that contrast those of somatic cells. We essentially have two types of cells in our body. The somatic cells, they are all of the cells that we've referred to thus far in this course. And then germ cells, which produce the gametes, which have half the genetic material of the somatic cells. So let's do some basic review of cell division. A somatic cell has a diploid copy of genetic material. So in the nucleus of every cell in your body, you have a homologous pair of chromosomes, and we see one homologous pair shown diagrammatically there. If we unfurl all the genetic material and lay out all of that material, then we see that there are 23 chromosomes. Here we see those 23 pairs of genetic material. We have the sex chromosome here, so this would be a male because it has an XY complement. So when cells seek to divide, then the goal is to have the two offspring cells have the same genetic material as the parent cell. So first, there's the matter of replicating each of the homologous pairs of chromosomes. So we see the one pair that we're focused on here has replicated. So we have identical copies of both chromatids. And then there's the matter of cell division, where that genetic material peels off to the two daughter cells. So we have the same genetic material in the offspring here as in the parent cells. And this N or 2N means diploid. So there's a total of 46 chromosomes, which is 23 pairs. Now, germ cells do something different because the goal is to produce cells that are haploid rather than diploid. So here we have the steps that are undergone in order to produce those haploid cells. Or actually, this is more broad than that, because we're going to consider what happens when sexual intercourse occurs and a zygote is produced, which is a cell that is essentially a fertilized egg cell. So first, there are the steps of gametogenesis, and we're going to talk about the details of gametogenesis in a moment, but the product of that is a haploid cell. That is, in females, each germ cell, and in the ovaries of a female, all of the germ cells that one is going to have in life are contained within the ovaries. So each one of those cells goes through gametogenesis. This is actually called oogenesis in the case of females. An oocyte is an egg. And one egg is produced from the single germ cell. And we can see that half of the genetic material essentially dissolves away, leaving just one set of chromosomes. Whereas in males, each germ cell produces 4 sperm, each of which is haploid, having half the genetic material. Now, if sexual intercourse successfully produces a fertilized egg, then that fertilization produces this zygote cell, which is diploid and a fusion of half genetic material from the sperm and half from the egg. So that's the overview, but let's consider the steps of gametogenesis, because there's a lot, we're going to talk a lot about the hormonal control of those stages. So in both cases, germ cells are produced by mitotic divisions, and at this stage they're diploid, so they have the 2 homologous chromosomes. Then there's the step of replication. This is much like mitotic division, but then the subsequent stages are different. We have 2 stages of meiosis. So in meiosis 1, we have, rather than the 2 complementary pairs of chromosomes like we saw in mitosis, instead these replicated chromosomes divide into one cell, and then we have the other set of chromosomes dividing in a separate cell. Then there's an additional division that separates each of those identical copies of chromosomes. This is where we get the 4 spermatids. In the case of the female system, instead of 4, all of essentially the investment goes into a single cell. Eggs are much more precious than sperm. And you can see that the lion's share of the cytoplasm goes into one of the cells, and then the other one, which has half of the genetic material of the replication stage, is much smaller. This is known as a polar body, which dissolves away. Then in meiosis 2, half of the replicated genetic material is retained, and then we have another polar body, which again dissolves away, and that the larger cell gives us our egg. And then if we have successful fertilization, then we're left with the diploid zygote there. Now the germ cells are produced by mitosis, so preceding all of this are many mitotic divisions to produce those germ cells that will ultimately produce the gametes. Okay, so males and females are different in terms of what happens in meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, and as a consequence, you've got this 4-fold difference in numbers of gametes that are produced from each of the cells. Another key difference is the timing of these events. So, as I mentioned, women have all of the germ cells for their whole lives contained within their ovaries. So all potential babies are generated, that is, all eggs that potentially could be fertilized, are generated during embryonic development. So when a female is born, her ovaries contain all of those replicated eggs, and that's the state that the development freezes at. It's the replicated state of genetic material. So then what occurs starting at puberty is each one of these cells goes through the stages of meiosis 1 and meiosis 2 to produce an egg that is ovulated. And so once a month, each one of these cells goes through these steps to produce that egg. Whereas in males, when a male is born, they're frozen at this much earlier state of mitotic divisions. So in the males, you have many mitotic divisions occurring or resuming at puberty and continuing through adulthood that allows for the opportunity of producing many more sperm than female produced eggs. And so that's all because of mitotic divisions. And then subsequent to those divisions, you have the meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. But as a consequence, not just of producing 4 spermatids for each germ cell, but also all of these mitotic divisions, you end up having males produce millions of sperm in a lifetime compared to the precious few eggs that are produced once a month by females. So we see these differences in meiosis, and now we see that there's a big difference in terms of the timing of these stages of gametogenesis. In subsequent lectures, we're going to consider the hormonal control of these differences. So there's a lot of similarities, but there are key differences, and here is the output or the result of those major differences. So let's consider where in the anatomy we see these stages of gametogenesis. So I've mentioned that the ovaries contain all of those germ cells in females, and After ovulation, where each one of those eggs is forcibly ejected from the ovary, that egg then carries through a tubule known as the fallopian tube, which is lined with cilia that propel the egg through it on their way to the uterus. The uterus is a muscularized organ that if a zygote is produced, or if an egg is fertilized, then it houses a baby that develops. And during labor, the uterus by that stage has developed tremendously and offers the muscles that essentially eject the baby at birth. Now, the uterus has a lining of cells that build up and break down on a monthly basis. That's known as the endometrium. So we'll talk a lot about the endometrium later. And then on the outside of the uterus, we have the vagina, or the cervix, and the vagina. And then as a mirror image, there's another ovary and another fallopian tube. And on average, most of the time, the ovaries take turns in which one offers the ovulation, so which one's going to produce the egg. And so when an egg is generated, we see on the right ovary there, we've got our egg that's going to be ovulated. And so it enters into the fallopian tube. And then a few days after that, when it's in the fallopian tube, is kind of the most ideal position for fertilization. So in the case of sexual intercourse and you have a bunch of sperm in the vagina, then there's the opportunity for the lucky sperm to make its way into the fallopian tube to fertilize the egg, to produce a zygote. Now, the next challenge for producing a baby or an embryo is to take that zygote and not lose it, and also have a bunch of hormonal machinery set up shop for a pregnancy. We'll get into those details later. But the first step here is to do what's called implantation, where the zygote adheres to the endometrium, and eventually a placenta will develop at that site to provide nutrients for the embryo. Okay, but our focus is largely on the production of the eggs, gametogenesis, and all of those steps that I described, the replication, meiosis 1, meiosis 2, can be visualized through a histological section of the ovary. So here we see a schematic version of that, where we have what are called primary and secondary oocytes. We're just going to focus our terminology on the stages of division. So we have the products of replication in this proximal position in the ovary, and then each one of those replicated cells, the oocytes, then moves on to eventually becoming ovulated. And so we can see, if we were to monitor the chromosomes at each of these stages, we would see the products of meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. Maybe you'd see a polar body produced. And each one of these cells is shepherded through its development and physically moved through a bundle of cells called a follicle. And the follicle is partially fluid-filled, and it's surrounded by cells that serve both sensory and integrative functions, which we'll talk about later. Now, after ovulation, this is called the ovulated oocyte, or we'll just refer to it as an egg. After ovulation, this follicle becomes an important structure that eventually dissolves away. It's called the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum produces progesterone and estrogen, which are important hormones that we'll discuss later. Now, there's two layers of cells within the follicle that serve as integrating centers in our control. And so if we zoom in on the follicle wall, we can see those layers. Now they're called the thecal cells and the granulosa cells. Just store that information later, because we're not going to really talk about what they do until a later lecture. But I just wanted to point it out here while we're discussing the anatomical position of everything. Now, in order for a pregnancy to initiate, that requires coordination between the ovaries and the uterus. The uterus breaks down on a monthly basis. So when menstruation begins, that would be a horrible time for implantation to occur. So we have to coordinate the timing of that and ovulation. So you don't want ovulation to occur at the same time that a woman gets her period, because that would result in a failed implantation. So what we're going to focus on when we talk about the hormonal control of the female reproductive system is what occurs in the ovaries, which we see here through all of its stages, relative to what's going on in the uterus, and how those two areas are coordinated with one another. Now, and this occurs on a monthly or 28-day cycle. And in the middle of that cycle, we have ovulation. Okay, so that's when the egg is released. Then fertilization, in most cases, occurs after that, just a few days after ovulation. Now, to parse the timing of all of these events, we're going to refer to the development of the follicle, which we see on the left as the follicular phase. And then when that becomes the corpus luteum, then we enter into the luteal phase. Now, while this is occurring, we have the coordinated events in the uterus, in particular, the lining or endometrium of the uterus. So we have the uterine cycle, where menstruation or a period occurs for about 5 days at the beginning of the cycle. And then we have a building up of the endometrium, which is essentially setting up shop for a potential implanted zygote. So the female reproductive system controls both gametogenesis and the uterine cycle. And this control, as we'll see later, is super complicated. Okay, it regulates change of both the gametes and the uterus. It involves multiple hormones that have negative and positive feedback loops, and we'll get into those details later. Let's turn our attention to the male reproductive system so we see where the gametes are produced there. So we have the penis and the scrotum. The scrotum is a muscularized sac that allows for thermoregulation of the testes. It turns out that the production of sperm is very temperature sensitive, and when cold, the muscles bring the testes close to the body, and when warm, they relax and allow the testes to move further away. By the way, this is just a little comparative tangent, but marine mammals don't have testes. They're not very hydrodynamic, or I should say they don't have a scrotum. They do have testes. And a scrotum wouldn't be very hydrodynamic. So instead, their testes are internalized, and they have this whole blood cooling system with the capacity for shunting, where blood essentially flows from the surface of the body into the interior of the body to regulate the temperature of the testes. So it's a trick that humans do not have. Instead, human males have this scrotum where the testes are exterior to the body. At any rate, sperm travel through a tubule that ultimately is released through the urethra of the penis during sex. So they travel through the vas deferens, that's the first name for the tubule, which the vas deferens can undergo peristalsis, much like the esophagus, to propel sperm. The sperm essentially, they are capable of swimming, but they get a little boost through the vas deferens. The seminal fluid gets a major injection of substances from the seminal vesicle and the prostate gland. So that includes lubricant for sex. There are chemicals for DNA protection. Also, the female reproductive system, the vagina and the uterus, are acidic environments. So there are buffers to neutralize the acid in the female reproductive system. And as I mentioned, Oh, so for reference, here's the urinary bladder. So urine travels through the urethra just like the seminal fluid does, but the urinary bladder is closed off during sexual arousal so that we don't have a mixture of urine with seminal fluid. Now, most of the seminal fluid is actually not semen itself, but rather the fluids that are secreted by the seminal vesicle and the prostate gland. All right, so let's follow the path of a little sperm. Imagine it's among hundreds of thousands of sperm that make their way through that path. And then during sex, in particular ejaculation, then we have the seminal fluid and all the sperm within it emerging from the urethra. Okay, so the testes are the site of sperm production. That sperm production occurs in a complex network of tubules. So if we take a cross-section through a testis, then we can see these tubules. They're called the seminiferous tubule. And when you make a cross-section through the seminiferous tubule, you can see all of those stages of gametogenesis, which are called spermatogenesis in the case of males. We see that cross-section here. The most superficial layers are the cells that undergo mitotic divisions and ultimately exhibit replication. So if you look at the genetic material, then you see that that material is replicated. Then as you look more towards the interior, then you can find the cells that are produced by meiosis 1 and ultimately meiosis 2. And then the most interior are the sperm themselves, right in there. So the question was, how are gametes produced by males and females? Our answer in this lecture is largely anatomical. We see the male system on the right, the female system on the left. So we have in the testes the production of sperm and the production of eggs, of course, in the female system within the ovaries. And what we're going to do is essentially revisit this question of gamete production, but from a control perspective in the subsequent lectures.